Every single day, $9.6 trillion changes hands in the global foreign exchange market. And on one side of nearly 90% of those transactions sits a single currency, the United States dollar. That number isn't a relic of American manufacturing dominance. The U.S. accounts for roughly 25% of world GDP, yet its currency commands almost all of global finance. The dollar's share of central bank reserves has slipped from 71% in 2000 to about 57% today, and yet it still towers over every competitor. The euro sits at 20%. The Chinese yuan, the currency of the world's second-largest economy, holds less than 2%. How did a single nation's currency achieve this kind of structural dominance? Why has every serious challenger, from Saddam Hussein to Muammar Gaddafi, met a violent end? And is the system that has ruled global finance for 80 years finally starting to crack? This is the story of dollar hegemony, how it was built, how it works, and whether it can survive what's coming. And to understand how the dollar got here, we actually need to start with the currency it replaced. The fall of sterling. Before the dollar, there was the pound. For most of the 19th century and into the early 20th, the British pound sterling was the world's dominant currency. The logic was simple. Britain had gold. Under the classical gold standard, a currency's credibility was directly tied to the metal reserves backing it. Britain, enriched by the Industrial Revolution and a global colonial empire, held more gold than anyone else. Sterling was the language of international trade. Central banks stored their reserves in pounds. London was the world's financial capital. Then came 1914. World War I was the most expensive event in human history up to that point. European powers needed weapons, ammunition, raw materials, and the only major industrial economy not being bombed was the United States. Britain, France, and their allies placed massive orders with American factories, but they couldn't pay in paper currency. They paid in gold. Between 1914 and 1918, gold flowed out of Europe and into American vaults at an extraordinary rate. The United States entered the war holding roughly $1.2 billion in gold reserves. By 1918, that figure had swelled to $2.8 billion. Britain's reserves moved in the opposite direction. In 4 years, Europe fought itself into bankruptcy, and America grew rich, selling it the means to do so. Britain wasn't ready to surrender. In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, not yet Prime Minister, made a fateful decision. He restored the pound to its pre-war gold parity at $1 to $4.86, a rate that dramatically overvalued British goods on world markets. Exports collapsed. Unemployment surged. In 1926, roughly 1.7 million workers walked off the job in the general strike. Churchill held on for 6 years, but by 1931 it was over. The pound was devalued by 25% overnight. Sterling's reign as the world's reserve currency was effectively finished, though it would take decades for the full transition to play out. Meanwhile, America wasn't celebrating either. The Wall Street crash of 1929 triggered the Great Depression. 9,000 banks failed. 13 million Americans lost their jobs. 1 in 4 workers stood idle. The world's monetary system was in ruins. Competitive devaluations, trade wars, and the collapse of the gold standard had left no stable anchor for global commerce. The question on every policymaker's mind was, could anyone build a system that would actually hold? As it turned out, someone could, but the answer would come not from consensus, but from raw power. Bretton Woods. In July 1944, with World War II still raging, 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Officially, they were there to design a new international monetary order. In practice, the outcome was largely predetermined. The United States held over 70% of the world's official gold reserves. It produced half of global industrial output. No other nation was in a position to dictate terms. 2 competing visions clashed at the conference. The British delegation was led by John Maynard Keynes, arguably the most influential economist of the 20th century. Keynes proposed creating a supranational currency called the Bancor, managed by an international clearing union. Under his plan, no single nation would dominate the system. Surplus countries would be penalized just as much as deficit countries, creating a self-correcting mechanism. The American delegation, led by Harry Dexter White, had a different idea entirely. The dollar would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency would peg to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both headquartered in Washington, both dominated by American voting shares, would police the system. When Keynes objected, the American position was blunt. "We have the gold, we have the factories, and we just saved your continent. This is the deal." Keynes understood what was happening. In private, he reportedly called the arrangement the exact opposite of what he had proposed. But Britain was broke, dependent on American loans, and in no position to walk away. The Bretton Woods Agreement was signed on July 22, 1944. Keynes died less than 2 years later, in April 1946, his health broken by the strain of the negotiations. The system that emerged was elegant in its simplicity. The dollar was as good as gold. Any central bank could exchange its dollars for bullion at the fixed rate. And since everyone needed dollars to trade, the United States effectively became the central bank of the world. But Bretton Woods was only the skeleton. The Marshall Plan provided the muscle. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States channeled roughly $13.3 billion, equivalent to about $170 billion today, into Western European reconstruction. The money came with conditions. Recipient nations had to spend it primarily on American goods and industrial equipment, lower trade barriers for American exports, and open their markets to American investment. By the time the program ended, Western European industrial production had surged 35% above pre-war levels, but the deeper effect was structural. Every dollar of Marshall Plan aid deepened Europe's dependence on dollar-denominated trade. American goods, American capital, and American currency became woven into the fabric of European economic life. The dollar wasn't just a medium of exchange, it was the operating system. Now, this system worked beautifully for about 20 years. But it contained a fatal flaw, one that an economist had already spotted: the crack-up and the pivot. As early as 1960, Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin identified what became known as the Triffin dilemma. Here's the core contradiction. For the global economy to grow, the world needed more and more dollars in circulation. But the only way to push dollars overseas was for America to run persistent trade deficits, buying more from the world than it sold. The more dollars flowed out, the thinner the gold backing became. And the thinner the gold backing, the less credible the $35 per ounce promise looked. It was a system that contained the seeds of its own destruction. By 1960, foreign-held dollars exceeded America's gold reserves for the first time. The gap only widened as Washington poured money into the Vietnam War, the space race, and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. The French were the first to call the bluff. In 1965, President Charles de Gaulle publicly accused the United States of enjoying an exorbitant privilege, a phrase coined by his finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, by printing paper to acquire real wealth. De Gaulle backed his words with action, dispatching naval vessels to physically transport French-held gold reserves from the New York Fed back to Paris. Germany and Japan began making similar demands. Between 1960 and 1971, American gold reserves fell from $17.8 billion to $10.2 billion. The hemorrhage was unsustainable. On the evening of August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and announced, without consulting America's allies, that the United States would temporarily suspend dollar-gold convertibility. This temporary measure has now lasted over 50 years. The Bretton Woods system was dead. The gold window would never reopen. Gold, which had been fixed at $35 per ounce, has since risen to over $3,000. Most observers expected the dollar to collapse. Without gold backing, it was just paper, a fiat currency like any other. Why would the world continue treating it as special? The answer came 3 years later, in one of the most consequential and least understood diplomatic deals in modern history. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War triggered an OPEC oil embargo. Prices quadrupled from $3 to $12 per barrel. The global economy spiraled into recession, but Washington saw opportunity in the chaos. In June 1974, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger visited Saudi Arabia and laid the political groundwork. The following month, Treasury Secretary William Simon, a former Wall Street bond trader with a reputation for bluntness, flew to Jeddah for the operational negotiations. According to documents declassified in 2016 through a Bloomberg FOIA request, Simon offered Saudi Arabia a package it could not refuse. The American side of the bargain: full military protection for the Saudi royal family, access to the most advanced American weapons systems, and comprehensive economic and technical assistance for Saudi modernization. The Saudi side: all oil exports would be priced exclusively in US dollars. Surplus oil revenues would be recycled into US Treasury securities, and Saudi Arabia would use its dominant position within OPEC to ensure other producers followed suit. Simon even arranged a special back channel, the Treasury's add-on mechanism, allowing Saudi Arabia to purchase treasuries outside public auctions. The Saudis' one condition was absolute secrecy. For the next 41 years, Saudi Treasury holdings were never disclosed separately in public data. They were buried in a generic oil exporters category alongside Kuwait and Nigeria. Both sides had their reasons for secrecy. The Arab world had just fought a war against Israel. Saudi Arabia could not afford to be seen cutting financial deals with Israel's primary ally, and Washington didn't want American voters, still angry about gas lines, to know that the country responsible for the embargo was also becoming one of America's largest creditors. The petrodollar system was born. The dollar had lost its golden anchor and found a new one in the world's most essential commodity. Every country that needed oil now needed dollars first. The dollar didn't just survive the collapse of Bretton Woods, it emerged stronger. So that's history. But knowing how the dollar got its dominance is only half the picture. The more interesting question is, how does the machine actually work, day to day right now? The machine. To understand dollar hegemony, you need to see it not as a single advantage but as an interlocking system, what political scientist Susan Strange called structural power. It's not the power to force someone to do something, it's the power to shape the structures within which everyone else must operate. And that system operates on several reinforcing layers. Start with oil. Because crude is priced in dollars, every oil-importing nation must accumulate dollar reserves simply to keep its economy running. Japan imports nearly all of its crude. South Korea imports about 70% from the Middle East. The European Union collectively imports billions of barrels annually. Before any of these countries can buy a single barrel, they must first acquire dollars, either by exporting goods to America or by selling on dollar-denominated markets. This creates a structural floor under dollar demand that has nothing to do with the strength of the American economy itself. Now follow the money one step further. Oil-producing nations receive hundreds of billions of dollars annually, but they can't spend it all domestically. Saudi Arabia has 35 million people, not 350 million. So the surplus gets parked in the deepest, most liquid asset market on Earth, U.S. Treasuries. This petrodollar recycling means the world's oil payments effectively flow back to Washington as low-cost loans. As of late 2025, foreign entities held approximately $5 trillion in U.S. government debt. This arrangement allows the United States to run persistent budget deficits at lower interest rates than its fiscal position would otherwise warrant, the financial dimension of the exorbitant privilege. Then there's the plumbing, the part most people never see, but that makes the whole system enforceable. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, connects over 11,000 financial institutions across 200 countries. It doesn't move money, it sends the messages that make money move. Underneath SWIFT sits CHIPS, the clearinghouse interbank payment system, which processes roughly 50% of all cross-border dollar transactions. And beneath that is FedWire, the Federal Reserve's domestic settlement system. Together, these three layers give the United States something no other country possesses: the ability to monitor, and if necessary sever, virtually any financial transaction on Earth that touches the dollar. When the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control places an entity on its sanctions list, it becomes effectively radioactive. No bank that wants to maintain access to dollar clearing will process its transactions. And on top of all of this sits the interest rate lever. The Federal Reserve's monetary policy decisions ripple across the globe. When the Fed raises interest rates, dollar-denominated assets become more attractive, pulling capital out of emerging markets and back into the United States. Local currencies weaken, dollar-denominated debts become harder to service, and asset prices in developing economies fall. When the Fed cuts rates, cheap dollars flood overseas, inflating asset bubbles in emerging markets. This pattern has repeated with remarkable consistency. The Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, the Asian financial crisis of 1997, the emerging market turmoil of 2015 and 2018, each followed a cycle of dollar easing followed by aggressive tightening. Now zoom out, and you can see that this entire system rests on three reinforcing pillars. Military power provides the ultimate guarantee. The United States operates over 750 military installations in more than 80 countries, maintains 11 carrier strike groups, and spends over $800 billion annually on defense. This military presence protects the sea lanes through which it flows, reassures allies who accept dollar dominance, and, as the cases of Iraq and Libya suggest, deters those who might challenge it. Financial infrastructure creates the plumbing that makes alternatives impractical. Wall Street's depth, the Treasury market's liquidity, the three major credit rating agencies, Moody's, S&P, and Fitch, and the dollar's role in derivatives pricing all create switching costs so high that most nations find it easier to stay within the system than to build alternatives. And technological leadership generates ongoing dollar demand. American tech companies, Apple, Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Alphabet, Meta, collectively account for a dominant share of global technology spending, almost all of it denominated in dollars. Semiconductor supply chains, cloud computing infrastructure, AI development tools, and software licensing all create structural demand for dollar-based transactions. These three pillars reinforce each other. Military power protects financial infrastructure. Financial infrastructure funds military power. Technological dominance generates the economic growth that sustains both. Breaking one pillar weakens the others, but no single challenge can topple all three simultaneously. That's the system. And for 50 years it held, because everyone believed two things: that the United States would not arbitrarily weaponize the dollar, and that there was simply no viable alternative. Both of those assumptions are now under serious strain. Let me walk you through what's changed. The cracks. The turning point came in February 2022. Within days of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Western nations did two things that shocked the global financial establishment. First, they expelled major Russian banks from SWIFT. Second, and far more consequentially, they froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western institutions. This was money Russia had accumulated over decades by selling oil and gas. It vanished over a weekend. The immediate effect on Russia was severe but survivable. The ruble initially crashed 30%, but Moscow imposed capital controls and pivoted to selling energy in rubles, yuan, and rupees. Within weeks, the ruble had recovered. By 2023, China-Russia trade exceeded $240 billion, conducted almost entirely outside the dollar system. A shadow fleet of tankers emerged, ships operating without Western insurance, outside Western shipping lanes, effectively creating a parallel oil logistics network. But the deeper damage was to the dollar system's credibility. Central bankers in Riyadh, New Delhi, Brasilia, and Jakarta all asked the same question that weekend. If Washington can freeze Russia's reserves, could they freeze mine? The response has been measurable. Central banks collectively purchased over 1,000 tons of gold in each of the years 2022, 2023, and 2024, the highest sustained buying in recorded history. China's holdings of U.S. Treasuries fell from a peak of $1.19 trillion to under $700 billion. Saudi Arabia has reduced its Treasury holdings by over 40% since 2020. These are not countries abandoning the dollar overnight, but they are hedging, and hedging is what happens when trust begins to fray. The weaponization problem is serious, but it's not the only crack. There's also the debt. The United States carries a national debt approaching $39 trillion, with a debt-to-GDP ratio exceeding 120%. In fiscal year 2024, for the first time in American history, annual interest payments on federal debt exceeded the entire defense budget. Let that register. The cost of servicing old borrowing now exceeds the cost of maintaining the world's most powerful military. The arithmetic is punishing. Higher interest rates, necessary to combat post-pandemic inflation, mean higher debt service costs, which generate larger deficits, which require more borrowing, which pushes rates higher still. The Congressional Budget Office projects debt could reach $50 trillion by 2030 under current trajectories. For decades, this was sustainable because the world had an almost limitless appetite for U.S. Treasuries. But the buyer base is shifting. Traditional sovereign purchasers, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, BRICS nations, are reducing their holdings. The slack is being picked up by domestic hedge funds, money market funds, and the Federal Reserve itself. When an economy starts financing its own debt internally at scale, it is no longer exporting its fiscal costs to the world. Think of it this way. For 50 years, the global need for dollars acted like a sponge, absorbing the inflation that American money printing would otherwise have caused at home. That sponge is shrinking. And while trust erodes and debt piles up, something else is happening quietly in the background. Alternative infrastructure is being built. On pricing, the Shanghai International Energy Exchange launched a yuan-denominated crude oil futures contract in 2018. Western analysts initially dismissed it. Today, it is the third largest oil futures market in the world, and the only major crude benchmark operated by a non-Western country in a non-dollar currency. On payments, mBridge, a central bank digital currency platform initially incubated by the Bank for International Settlements and involving the central banks of China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and the UAE, enables cross-border settlement without routing through New York. Saudi Arabia's central bank formally joined in 2024. The project has processed over 4,000 transactions with cumulative settlement exceeding $55 billion, up from $22 million just 2 years earlier. On lending, the BRICS New Development Bank offers sovereign financing without the political conditionality attached to IMF loans. No forced austerity, no structural adjustment programs. For many developing nations, this represents the first non-Western option for balance of payments support. None of these systems is yet mature enough to replace dollar infrastructure. The yuan accounts for less than 4% of SWIFT transactions. mBridge is still scaling. The NDB's lending capacity is a fraction of the IMF's. But the question is no longer whether alternatives exist. It's how fast they can grow. And there's one more threat that almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important of all. The petrodollar system's foundational premise is that the world cannot function without oil, and oil cannot be purchased without dollars. But what happens when countries increasingly power their economies with domestically produced wind, solar, and nuclear energy? The structural demand for dollars doesn't get stolen by another currency, it simply disappears. As Deutsche Bank put it in a recent research note, a world that is increasingly energy self-sufficient naturally requires fewer dollar reserves. The ground beneath the petrodollar isn't just cracking. In the long run, it may be evaporating. So with all of these cracks widening, the obvious question is, does this mean the dollar is finished? The verdict: no, at least not in the way most predictions suggest. History offers a useful guide. The British pound's decline as the world's reserve currency wasn't a sudden collapse. It was a gradual erosion that took roughly 30 to 40 years after World War I. Even into the 1950s, the pound still accounted for a significant share of global reserves. Currency transitions are slow because they require not just economic shifts but institutional rebuilding, new payment systems, new legal frameworks, new habits of trust. The dollar retains enormous advantages. It dominates nearly 90% of foreign exchange transactions. It accounts for roughly 80% of trade finance. U.S. Treasury markets remain the deepest and most liquid on Earth. When crises hit, and the irony here is almost too perfect, capital still flows into dollars, because in a world of imperfect options, the dollar remains the least bad one. Even countries actively building alternatives still hold most of their reserves in dollars and conduct most of their trade in dollars. The yuan cannot replace the dollar until China opens its capital account, allows free convertibility, establishes deep and transparent domestic capital markets, and builds the institutional trust that comes from decades of rule of law consistency. Beijing has shown no willingness to do any of these things. The euro has the institutions but lacks fiscal unity. It is the currency of 19 separate sovereign budgets, not one. What is far more likely than a sudden collapse is a slow, uneven fragmentation, a shift from a unipolar dollar system towards something messier and more multipolar. The dollar might decline from 57% of reserves to 40 or 45% over the next 2 decades, with the euro, yuan, gold, and possibly digital currencies absorbing the difference. The dollar would still be first among equals, but the gap would narrow, and America's ability to use the currency as a geopolitical weapon would be correspondingly reduced. The economist Kenneth Rogoff, a former IMF chief economist, published a book recently titled Our Dollar, Your Problem. The title comes from a remark made by Treasury Secretary John Connally in 1971, just after Nixon closed the gold window. When European finance ministers protested, Connally reportedly told them, "The dollar is our currency, but it's your problem." Rogoff's central argument is that the greatest threat to dollar dominance comes not from China or BRICS, but from America's own unforced errors, spiraling debt, the weaponization of finance, and an institutional arrogance that takes the exorbitant privilege for granted. Every empire in history believed its dominance was permanent. Rome believed it. Britain believed it. The Soviet Union believed it. The United States built something genuinely different, a system of structural power that doesn't require territorial conquest. But structural power still depends on trust. And trust, once cracked, is far easier to break than to rebuild. The dollar isn't dying, but for the first time in 80 years, the world is no longer asking whether alternatives are possible. It's building them. If this helped you understand a system that affects every economy, every portfolio, and every price tag on the planet, consider subscribing. We break down the forces that actually move money, not the headlines, but the structures underneath. I'll see you in the next one.